we have a little extra time to deal with this chapter. Okay, so last time, in addition to finishing up the urinary system and talking about micturition, as well as the bladder and the urethra and some of the things associated with it, we talked about the different fluid compartments in the body. So intracellular fluid, extracellular fluid, and then inside of extracellular fluid there was the plasma volume and then the interstitial fluid, those two big spaces, right? So, just like you all learned in chemistry, a solution is water with something dissolved in it or another solvent. But anyway, so in our bodies, water doesn't exist in isolation. It's always interacting and it's always affected by the different minerals that are present too. Okay, so the key minerals in the body are, given in this table. And for our purposes, the ones I want you to be particularly familiar with are along here at the bottom. So sodium and potassium, which you've been hearing about those since the start of A&P last semester, right? Critical in lots of the moment-to-moment things that cells do because of that membrane potential, that the difference between sodium outside and potassium inside makes. Okay, so sodium and potassium levels are critical to be in the normal range or there will be problems. In addition, calcium, because calcium is my favorite ion in the body, and the reason it's my favorite ion in the body is because it does some of the coolest stuff that we human beings do. So, or at least it's a component of the system. So nerve conduction, muscle contraction, calcium is the key, right? The trigger for those events. And so because of that, we can't survive calcium shifts of very much at all. So to give you an example, one of the things that's present in the lethal injection cocktail is a high concentration of calcium. Because if you give somebody a bunch of calcium in a hurry, their heart stops because it squeezes and stops, and that results in death. So, just an example, calcium is hugely important. Now, unlike sodium and potassium, though, for calcium, we have a storage of calcium that we bring with us all the time in the bones. So, it's a nice system. In some ways, it would be nice if we had that for sodium and potassium, but we don't. And then, so the bulk minerals are minerals that are found in relatively large quantities. So all of these numbers are bigger than 29 grams. In 29 grams, it's not very much, right? 29 grams of water is an ounce, a fluid ounce. So this isn't very much, but this is spread out over the whole body. Now, we also have some minerals that are important for survival, but are found in much less quantity in the body. So we call those the trace minerals. The only one that I want you to be familiar with, you already kind of are, which is iron. And iron plays a role because it interacts with oxygen very effectively. So we find it in hemoglobin, we find it in myoglobin, which is like hemoglobin but in muscles instead of in blood cells. And then in the cytochromes. Cytochromes are part of the biochemical magic that happens inside the mitochondria, part of that electron transport chain. Okay. So we only have about 3.9 grams of iron, which is not very much. But you think about hemoglobin is a huge molecule that has a grand total of 4 iron ions, 4 atoms of iron. So even though we only have a little iron, it's spread out and utilized in such a way that the little bit we have is critical that we have. Now, we do store a little bit of iron in our liver. In the form of transferritin is what it's called, or ferritin. And so we can survive periods of our lives where our iron intake is very low. Now, we talked about how flour is supplemented with different vitamins. It's also supplemented with iron. So iron deficiency in the United States is pretty rare today. But in other parts of the world, it's still very common. And if you look back 2,000 years, iron in people's diets vary according to their intake. In periods of time where, herds were available for meat to eat, iron intake went way up. But then in the wintertime, it would go way down. So we do have a storage capacity for iron, too. We also are great iron recyclers. So Except for the loss of blood out of the body, we hold on to iron very, very well. So the same iron ions are recycled over and over and over again. So these other bulk minerals and trace minerals, they're important, but their roles are a little more esoteric. So I don't want you to spend time looking too much into those. Phosphorus comes to mind a little bit because phosphate is part of our energy system, right? Adenosine triphosphate, ATP. So it's another critical player, but we don't talk about it very much because phosphorus is readily available in our in the natural human diet. So it's pretty rare to have a phosphorus deficiency. In the trace minerals, these are getting more attention than they ever used to, particularly in advanced healthcare and medicine, because more and more often we are using intravenous methods to provide people nutrition, right? So somebody who is comatose, like in the ICU, well, they can't eat, and oftentimes, if they're sick enough, we don't want to put anything into their GI tract, tube feeds, in other words, because that will whisk away metabolic energy for their healing. So we try to give them everything that they need in their veins, and these trace minerals can be a problem there because we don't know exactly how much of these things we need. And this is a short list. There's actually a much longer list of minerals we need in teeny tiny little amounts in order to be healthy. So that's what these represent. You know, copper, believe it or not, is not just found in plumbing pipes, but we actually need some in our body for various things like hemoglobin synthesis. So these are rare, tiny amounts, you know, like manganese, 11 milligrams in a 70-kilo human being. You know, so that's a little tiny bit in a great big thing, but we still have to have it. Okay, so bulk minerals and trace minerals. But what we're going to spend most of our time talking about in this chapter is these top two, sodium and potassium. Because calcium we talked about at length in the endocrine chapter, when we talked about calcium homeostasis, parathyroid hormone, and calcitonin and their effects on the body. And in the skeletal system chapter, oftentimes the calcium homeostasis is covered there too, but I know you all didn't have that because of the changeover last semester. But, okay, you'll get it eventually. So, sodium and potassium are the major players. And of all the lab tests that are done, one of the most common, probably in the top 5, is the sodium level of a patient's blood, okay? And oftentimes, the sodium level is misunderstood by not necessarily healthcare providers, but people who are looking at patients' labs. They misunderstand what the sodium means. So I wrote this up to avoid that for all of you, okay? So water and salt are in this close relationship. You never have one change without the other changing. There's always this interaction between the two. And it's because salt dissolves very readily in water. Water and salt both move around the body's compartments very, very easily. Okay, so that everything can move and they can stay in balance. So typically, you know, when we look at, well, here, I'll come back to that. Okay, so salt is oftentimes what the body monitors to control water. Okay, so, and I'll show you some examples of this in a minute. And the reason for this is this bullet point right here, and it's a refresher from concentration chemistry, from general chemistry. You know, there's 2 ways to change the concentration of a solute in a solvent, right? One is to add more solvent. The other is to add or take away solvent. The other is to add or take away solute. So you have 2 things that can change. And in our bodies, what typically happens is when the sodium concentration goes down, the body's response to that is not to take in more sodium. It's to get rid of extra water. So if we have the same amount of sodium and we take water away, the concentration gets higher, right? Even though we've taken something away, the concentration of what's left goes up. So for this water and salt, instead of the body directly affecting the variable that has changed in a homeostasis feedback loop, it affects something different, all right? So we change water volume, not salt levels, in response to sodium concentration. Okay, so some examples that I've given over here at the bottom. So you get a patient's labs, on the computer, and there it is. The sodium is too low. The sodium is below the normal range. Now, what many people would think is, oh, this patient is lacking sodium. They have a sodium deficit, right? Because their sodium level is too low. That seems to make intuitive sense. But because of how the body manages water and salt together, it is usually that if the sodium concentration is too low, it's because the patient has extra water on board. So they've been diluted by pure water. The opposite is also true. You get the lab and it says the sodium concentration is very high compared to normal. And you think, oh, we have to get this excess sodium out of the patient. Well, that would be a disaster. Because what the real problem is that they have a water deficit. So it isn't that their sodium levels or their sodium content of the body is off. It's that their water volume is off by either too much water or too little water. Okay, so we call too little sodium in the blood hyponatremia. Hypernatremia is its opposite. But they don't usually reflect a sodium problem. They reflect a water problem instead. Okay, so many of us at some point in our lives have been mildly dehydrated for one reason or another. Well, one way you can test that in the blood is to look at the sodium level. If the sodium level is high, that implies dehydration, that the patient has a water deficit. And when you go to treat that patient, you give them more water back than you do salt back to help to correct that dehydration cause. Now, in the rare case, it really is sodium that's the problem. But for the common case, it's water that's the issue instead. All right, so, and we're going to see some examples of how this water and salt thing go together as we go through some of these feedback loops. Yes?
Is there different concentrations for...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so not all IVs are the same. There's a whole bunch of them, actually. And depending on the patient's characteristics, you'll choose one kind over another. So a normal, healthy adult, we usually use D5 half normal saline.
Right.
But there's D5 quarter, there's quarter normal, there's 0 normal, which is basically pure water. So yeah, there's a whole big range. There's also normal saline, which is what you give somebody if they have lost a bunch of blood, let's say. So yeah, you'll learn all about that later. Huh?
Is that what they push through in IVs before they give medication to? Is the
normal saline? Usually it's normal saline. Sometimes it's half normal. People tend to have plenty of salt in their bodies, so we don't always have to give them all the salt they need. Because if we give normal saline, people have a tendency to get edematous. They get extra fluid on board. So yeah, that's a topic for a more advanced class. But yeah, it's not all IV bags are the same. Start reading them when you're in the clinic or whatever to see how they're different. There's also a fancy one called lactated ringers, which is what the surgeons love, because it has a few extra things that are supposed to help people recover faster from illness and all that. So, good question. All right. So, can you hit that first light for me, Hayden? Yeah. So we're going to look at the 4 possibilities. Okay, if water and salt go together, that leaves us with 4 things that can happen. We can have a rising sodium concentration or a falling sodium concentration, or we can have a rising water volume or a decreasing water volume. Okay, so we start with the most common one, which is a rising sodium concentration. All right, so you're sitting here in homeostasis, and it's movie night, and you get the super giant mega popcorn thing, right? That looks like a 5-gallon bucket. And by the end of the movie, you and your friends have gone through that whole thing. Well, you've added a bunch of salt to your system. Now, the response to that is going to be a change in sodium concentration. You took the fixed volume of water, and you added salt to it. So the concentration goes up. Your sodium concentration goes up. Well, that affects some receptors in the hypothalamus that are sensitive to osmolarity, or how much stuff is dissolved in the blood. Since sodium is one of the main things dissolved in the blood, this increase in sodium causes an increase here. So what happens? Well, from experience, we know what happens. You get thirsty, right? You eat something salty, and then you're looking for something to drink. Well, that is directly triggered by these osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. As your sodium concentration goes up, ADH is released. ADH reduces urine production, so it reduces urine output. And at the same time, it stimulates thirst. Remember, ADH is antidiuretic hormone or a desert hormone, right? So in the desert, you get thirsty because you're evaporating sweat. You've got to put that water back. So you eat a bunch of salt, now you drink. Okay, well, how does that affect things? Well, as you take in extra water, and as the intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid shift, as water comes out of your cells to try to fix this sodium concentration that's too high, we end up with a net increase in total body water, right? So as we add more water to the salt that we've taken in, eventually we do get a decrease in the sodium level, but at the expense of an increased fluid volume, okay? So we put salt in, and we fixed the high sodium level, but not by affecting sodium. We don't see anything here where sodium is leaving the body. Instead, water is being added or conserved. So to fix a high sodium concentration, the body has conserved water. So your total fluid volume has gone up. So after you've had the popcorn, you've had the soda, at that point, your body contains more fluid as well as more salt than before this whole thing started. Okay, which, there's a range. We can tolerate a range of total body water, but too much water causes high blood pressure. So there has to be a fix for that. More on that to come. So here, this mechanism fixes a rising sodium concentration by diluting it with extra water. All right. Well, what about the opposite? Now the sodium concentration is falling. How does the body respond to that? So when would you get into this circumstance? This is the less common one. Let's say that you took in lots of pure water. If somebody gave you the terrible idea of drinking distilled water instead of drinking water, for example. Okay, so you take in a bunch of that, that's going to cause a decrease in your sodium concentration. Well, the hypothalamus recognizes that, and the response there is the opposite. ADH secretion decreases, so your urine output goes up to get rid of that excess fluid. Your thirst center is suppressed, so you stop drinking the distilled water, which you shouldn't be drinking in the first place. So we have a decreased input and an increased output, both of which result in water loss above sodium loss. So if you take a solution of sodium and water and you remove water from it, it's going to get more concentrated, right? So that initial decrease in sodium level causes a increase in water release, which causes an increase in sodium level, and now we're back here to normal. So here again, we fix the sodium problem by changing a water thing, right? By, in this case, getting rid of water. Yes?
So when it says increased sodium levels, is that really increased sodium levels, or is it increased sodium concentration?
It's increased sodium concentration is the better term.
Okay.
But you'll hear people call it levels. That's why I think they use this term.
Okay.
Because you get the lab and they say, well, what's the sodium level? Oh, well, it's 155. So it's really a concentration is what we measure.
Because it's not increased, because it's not more sodium.
Correct. It's not more sodium. It's more concentrated sodium because the water is been taken away. Yes,
you
hit it right on the head. That is exactly what the issue is. It's people talk about sodium levels, but we're not really talking about the body's sodium. We're talking about the body's water. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Because we don't really have a way to measure the total sodium in a patient. It'd be nice if we did, but there's no way to do that. So we can only look at what's in the blood. Yeah.
So how does sodium actually leave the body?
It leaves the body through the kidneys. The opposite of aldosterone. So when aldosterone is not present, the kidneys dump sodium into the urine. So that's how it gets out. Eventually, we're coming to that too. All right. So we fixed a falling sodium concentration by getting rid of a bunch of water. All right. So in both of these cases, we've affected the body's fluid volume. In this case, to fix adding salt to the body, we added water. Okay, well, if you kept doing that, you kept eating the popcorn, went and got a second soda, right? Eventually, you're going to have this problem. Your extracellular fluid volume, the volume of water in your body, is going to be too high for your vascular system. Okay, so as extracellular fluid volume goes up, that makes your circulating plasma volume also go up. And back to our cardiovascular chapter, that makes your venous return go up, which makes your stroke volume go up, which makes your cardiac output go up, which makes your blood pressure go up, right? So there's this long connected string. So eventually that excess fluid circulating from your salt and water intake causes this system to take hold. All right, so here we are in normal homeostasis. We had an increase in our extracellular fluid volume because of salt and water. That causes an increase in blood volume, and that causes these natriuretic peptides to be released from the heart. Okay, so the heart has atria. Remember that? Well, at the beginning of cardiac contraction, the atria get stretched when there's too much plasma volume, when you have too much water on board. When those cells stretch, the response to that is to release these hormones called natriuretic peptides. All right, take this word apart. Natrium is sodium. That's why we call it Na when we write it. Uretic is urination. So these are peptides that cause sodium to be urinated. Okay, so they do just what their name says. They cause an increase in sodium loss in the urine. Now, water follows salt. We learned that the other day. So if you're losing salt in your urine, you're going to lose water in your urine too, because the water follows along behind the salt. So now we have an increase in sodium excretion and an increase in water excretion, both. Those things are going to result in a reduction in blood volume. If urine goes out, that water goes out of you. So the initial problem, which is having too much water in the body, is addressed. These natriuretic peptides also reduce thirst, so you don't continue to add to the problem, and they inhibit the system that does the opposite. They inhibit the system that works to conserve fluid at the same time. So you turn off the water conservation, you turn on the water elimination, and we get a reduced blood volume, which causes a reduced blood pressure. That causes a reduction in extracellular fluid volume, fixes the original problem, which is that these cardiac cells were getting stretched. Okay? So here's a little summary. So if the total body sodium gets too high, and you can drink, in other words, you're not unconscious, you're not imprisoned or somehow being prevented from intaking water. As your sodium goes up, you will drink. That causes your extracellular fluid volume to get too high, and that triggers this system, the natriuretic peptide system, which works to reduce water and salt to reduce extracellular fluid volume. So this is the outcome of this. Okay, so as your sodium goes up, you take in water. Well, eventually you're going to have too much water. This gets rid of the too much water. It also gets rid of the too much salt at the same time, so that your body goes back into balance. Okay, so this is volume too high. This is the less common scenario, but it does happen in the day-to-day. You know, we don't measure the salt and water that we take in. You know, we just eat things and drink things, right? So sometimes we take in more salt than we need, followed by more water than we need, and then we have a higher urine output for a little while to get rid of that excess that we took in. Okay, so we get this case when there's too much total body water, too much total body sodium, or both, all right, which happens like in our movie theater example. Okay. What about the other case? Well, this is the much more common case, and this is what happens when the extracellular fluid volume is too low. Now, here's bonus, because this we've already looked at. We looked at it in 2 other places so far in the semester. This is the renin-angiotensin the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Same system that the cardiovascular system uses to support blood pressure, particularly when there's been a fluid loss. Same system that the kidney uses to make sure there's adequate blood pressure to drive glomerular filtration. And it's also the system that the body uses to deal with the case of a total fluid volume that's too low. So how can you get this? Well, the most common way to get this is excess water loss. So, hot day, not drinking very well, you sweat more than you're taking in, right? So your body water is going down all the time. Diarrheal illnesses can do this because you're excreting more water than you're taking in. But we can also get this situation when we have too little total body sodium, which does not happen very often because there's plenty of salt in the things that we eat. But in the patient who's taken the low-salt diet to the extreme, you can actually get this, which is the opposite thing than you want. Typically, we tell people to lower their sodium intake when their blood pressure is high, right? Well, if they take it too far and they eliminate all salt from their diet, they actually end up with a blood pressure that's too high because they trigger this renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system because their fluid volume is too low to support their cardiovascular health. So there's no such thing as a no sodium diet. There is only a low sodium diet, okay? All right, so we have this case. So what happens? All right, so normal extracellular fluid volume, and we have a falling volume, which is going to result in falling blood pressure, either because of fluid losses or fluid and sodium losses. So we get a decrease in blood volume and blood pressure. The kidneys sense that, right, because they need blood pressure to generate glomerular filtration. So when glomerular filtration drops, they secrete renin. Renin triggers the production of angiotensin II. Eventually, a decrease in blood volume and blood pressure trigger aldosterone to be released and ADH to be released. Both of these cause fluid retention. Okay, ADH triggers water retention, aldosterone triggers salt retention, and then water retention follows, right? Because water always follows salt. So to remind you, aldosterone always does those two things: sodium retention and potassium excretion. Always together. They can't do one without the other, which comes up in many different metabolic situations. So aldosterone does both of those things. Okay, so the effects of this are increased urinary sodium retention, so salt retention. Salt retention causes water retention. Okay, so we have a decrease in urinary water loss. ADH also causes a decrease in urinary water loss. ADH makes you thirsty, which causes an increase in water intake. So these effects arise from this problem, a decreased blood volume and blood pressure. Eventually, these things together will cause an increase in extracellular fluid volume, and now we're back to homeostasis again. Okay, so this is the fluid side of this situation. So as sodium concentration, or sorry, I messed that one up. As sodium concentrations fall, we get, it triggers this system where we get rid of, I'm back here. Let me stop and back up, okay? Too much sodium causes too much extracellular fluid volume. Too little sodium causes too little extracellular fluid volume. So we do things to recover that fluid volume and hold on to the water we have as well as replacing it with extra water. So you can see the complexity here, that sodium and water are always working together because the body addresses sodium issues, sodium concentration problems, by addressing water problems, until we get to the case where blood pressure is affected. In this case, when blood pressure is too high because fluid volume is too high, we dump excess fluid and salt. When it's too low, then we hold on to water and salt. All right. So we'll do a couple of questions just verbally, and we'll go on. Okay, so when pure water, this is distilled water, you should never ever drink distilled water, okay, is consumed, which of those things happen? And I'll give you a minute to think about it, because this is a harder question than it sounds. What do you think? Stumped? All right, let's go through it. Okay, so we have our two compartments, intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid. We can't directly put anything in here, right? Because cells have their own membranes. They control entry and exit. But for the organism, for the human, we can do something here. We can take water, put it in the patient, and it goes into the extracellular fluid. So if we take pure water, these are osmolarity numbers. I made them up. Okay, so if we add water to this, well, this number is going to go down, right? Because the same amount of solute, we added more solvent. So the concentration goes down. So now we have a difference between here and here. And what will result, because water can pass between these two compartments very easily, so now we have a higher osmolarity and a lower. That's going to move, so water is going to go this way. So we put water in. Now it's flowing over here until this balances, right? So we'll say 250, 250. And all told, we've added water to this whole system, so this whole thing has gotten bigger, right? Because we haven't taken any water away yet. So when pure water is consumed, the osmolarities of both fluid compartments fall, right? Because we started at 300, so that's true. They do that. The volume of the extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid, they don't decrease, they increase, right? Because we've added water to the system. So it's not B or C. And a fluid shift occurs, and the volume of the intracellular fluid decreases. No, it's just the opposite. We put water in the extracellular space, it flows into the intracellular space as long as it can. Okay, so it's an increase. And the ECF becomes hypertonic. No, in fact, it's hypotonic. Okay, those are probably words you've not heard before. Hypertonic and hypotonic. Okay. So osmolarity is like concentration of everything in a solution. Did you all talk about osmolarity in chemistry, I hope?
We did
Good.
that last semester.
Huh?
We talked about last semester.
Last semester, good. Because it's a difficult concept. So tonicity has everything to do with osmolarity. All right, so we'll say blood, body fluids. So this is normal, right? Normally, the blood and the bodily fluids, they have an osmolarity because they have stuff dissolved in it. So for normal, we call that isotonic. Okay? Isotonic means it has the osmolarity of normal body fluids. So here we'll say osmolarity of normal body fluids is isotonic. Well, what if we have greater than normal? We call that hypertonic. And we have less than normal. We call that hypotonic. Now, these are not esoteric physiology words. These are words you're going to hear taking care of patients in the hospital in particular. Okay? Remember we were talking about IV fluids a little bit ago and how they're not all the same? Well, there are hypertonic IV fluids, there are hypotonic IV fluids, and there are isotonic IV fluids. So it depends on what you want to do with the patient. If you want to give them fluid that they don't already have, in other words, we want to increase their fluid and salt volume at the same time, well then we would choose isotonic fluids. That's the normal saline you get as part of resuscitation. That's lactated ringers that you get as part of surgery. But let's say that they have excess water on board. Well, we don't want to give them isotonic fluids because that's just going to make the problem worse. Instead, we might give them fluids that are a bit hypertonic to put a little more water in. Well, if they have too much water on board, we might give them hypertonic fluids to help get some of that extra water out. Same with hypotonic. So just that's what those words mean. It's related to the osmolarity of normal body fluids. And it's too advanced a topic for us to get into, but you're going to choose your IV fluids based on their characteristics in terms of tonicity. And this isn't subtle. So if I take normal cells out of a patient and I put them into a hypertonic solution, they're going to shrivel up and shrink because the water is going to go out of them. If I take them and put them in a hypotonic solution, the cells are going to get bigger and may even pop eventually from all the osmotic pressure. So this really matters, and it's why IV fluids, even though they're commonplace, they're a thing to pay particular careful attention to because you can mess a person up with the wrong IV fluids in the wrong situation. So the hypertonic, hypotonic, isotonic. Okay. Yes?
So say that does happen, then it goes into this homeostasis of the ECF volume is too high.
Yes. Let's say we give, a patient comes in and their blood pressure is low and we think they've had some trauma, but they haven't actually lost any blood. We just think they have. So we give them a liter of normal saline. We're going to push them into this.
What about if that question you had, if that situation happened, it would go to that, right?
If which one? Person has too little fluid on board?
No, if the person drank the pure water.
Drink the pure water?
It would go to that, or what?
Pure water, yes. They're going to go into extracellular fluid volume is too high. And it's going to trigger reduction. It's going to trigger water and sodium loss.
Okay.
Yes. Yep. So what I mean by pure water and distilled water, my comments about that. You go to the store and there's the water aisle, right? You want drinking water. Distilled water is what we use in the laboratory. Distilled water is water that has had everything removed, all of the minerals. And while some people would say, well, isn't that the healthiest water you can drink? No. Distilled water is a very powerful solvent. It will dissolve the calcium out of your teeth, and it will drop your sodium level and cause this to happen, where you'll have a falling sodium concentration and a reduction in your water loss. So you can end up having way more extra fluid on board. So a little public service announcement. Okay.
How do LASIK work then?
Huh?
How does LASIK work?
LASIK works by tricking the kidney into thinking that aldosterone is absent. So LASIK acts like aldosterone but doesn't make the pump start. So you get sodium excretion as the salt goes into the urine, the water follows behind it. The problem is you can run into potassium problems with that too. Okay, so when pure water, we did that one already. Next one. This is another thinking one. Consuming a meal high in salt will do what? Yes. Who said C? Yes, C. So this is a will. This is not a might. This is not a could. This is a will. So if you take in a bunch of salt and you can drink, that's a key. If you can drink water, your total body water is going to go up. So the classic movie theater example, if you weighed people going into the movie theater and weighed them coming out, the people that had the popcorn and the soda would all weigh more. Because they have more fluid volume leaving than they did coming, right? So, yes, that really will happen. All right. I just wanted to check something. Okay. So that's sodium and its intimate relationship with water. I recommend that you go through these 4 cases of rising and falling sodium, rising and falling fluid volume, and how they relate. Okay. Let's see. Yeah.
So when you eat sodium, will it make your blood osmolarity go up?
Yes, that's what you
Yeah.
drink. Mm-hmm. And it's as your osmolarity goes up, that's what triggers the thirst. So you reach for the drink because your osmolarity is too high. We are thirsty because our osmolarity is too high. It has nothing to do with our water balance. So if you take a patient, you give them hypertonic saline, 3% saline, they'll get very, very thirsty. Not because they don't have enough water, but because they have too much salt. Okay, so sodium is obviously the major player, but potassium gets just as much attention in the care of patients as sodium does. Now, sodium tells us about a patient's fluid status, typically. Potassium is a separate animal entirely. Okay, potassium is the primary cation found inside of cells, right? So most of the body's potassium is locked up inside of cell membranes. Oh, come back here. Which means that it's very difficult to measure a patient's current potassium, how much potassium they have in their body, because the potassium is all inside of cells, and the only thing we can really measure is extracellular fluid, specifically blood, plasma, the extracellular component of blood, which is plasma, is what we measure. Okay, so we have, the same factors in play in potassium that we have in sodium, and that is there's an intake, so this is the digestive tract. This is food, right? Food has potassium in it. That potassium is absorbed. Eventually, potassium leaves the body through the kidney. Well, in between, though, we have the cells. So the potassium that enters the body is very quickly absorbed into cells, and the potassium that leaves the body comes out of cells just before it's removed from the body. So at any given time, if we sample the blood, we have a very low potassium level because it's all inside of cells, not floating around like sodium is. Okay? So the potassium level in the blood does not reflect the total content of potassium in the body because, like it says, 98% of the potassium is inside of cells where we can't measure it. Okay? So, how is that done? Because there's a pump. The sodium-potassium pump is constantly pumping potassium into cells and sodium out of cells. So that's how the potassium that gets absorbed ends up inside of cells, is through that potassium channel. Now, there's always a little potassium that leaks back out through the leak channel. That's where we get this 5 milliequivalents. So, as I say on here, 98% of the body's potassium is inside cells where we can't look at it. But ultimately, the potassium that comes in has to go out, or our potassium levels would go up all the time, right? Our total potassium content would keep increasing. So if you follow a patient's urinary potassium day by day, it will vary according to the amount of potassium in their diet. As the potassium increases going in, potassium going out goes in. Now, for people with normal healthy kidneys and not on any medications, that is no big deal. The system evolved like that, so that we don't care about the potassium in our diet typically, unless we have some other problem that's happening, because our body just gets rid of whatever excess potassium we take in. Okay. How? If potassium levels, or if the potassium content of the food that we eat changes, well, there has to be some system for the body to know and to respond by either increasing the rate of secretion or decreasing the rate. So how much potassium does the kidney put into the urine? It's ultimately determined by our friend aldosterone. Okay, this is aldosterone's second hat. Aldosterone does two separate things let me rephrase that. Aldosterone does one thing, boom, but it does it for two different reasons, okay? And those reasons are separately controlled. So the first reason we secrete aldosterone is what we've talked about already. When our sodium and water when our sodium and water levels or status, we have too much sodium and water, aldosterone is secreted to cause, I messed that up. It's sodium retention. Okay, so when our fluid status is too low, we have too little blood pressure. Sodium is retained, potassium is excreted. So that's the first reason. The second reason we secrete aldosterone is when our potassium levels are too high. So if I take a patient and I give them a bolus of potassium chloride, their aldosterone levels will shoot up because the body is saying, too much potassium, we need to increase the amount of potassium that is secreted at the kidney. So in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting system, we have these aldosterone pumps on the surface that pump potassium out of cells into the urine and out of the body. Okay, so that means there's two ways you can cause aldosterone to be secreted. This is way number one here, when the fluid volume is too low. See, aldosterone released. This is way number two. When potassium levels are too high, aldosterone is released to get rid of it. So one molecule does one thing, but it does it for two different reasons. Now, why am I making such a big deal about that? Because this aldosterone molecule comes into play a lot in taking care of patients. Number one, because it plays a role in blood pressure, and as you all know, high blood pressure is one of the most common chronic illnesses in the world, right? So we treat a lot of high blood pressure. The other issue is potassium levels. Some people have trouble maintaining their potassium levels when they're on certain blood pressure medicines. And now that should maybe make a little more sense. If aldosterone works on blood pressure and aldosterone works on potassium levels, you can imagine that the two might interact. Okay, so many patients who are on a diuretic, like you were talking about Lasix, that's just one of them, because aldosterone causes potassium secretion, we end up with patients who are deficient in potassium oftentimes, or the opposite, their potassium levels are too high because of that effect. So potassium is controlled through aldosterone through that separate mechanism. Okay, so big deal about that little thing. So why do we care about potassium levels? The human being, really mammals in general, are very sensitive to potassium concentrations that are not normal. When you learned about the membrane potential, you saw that potassium plays a major role in making that electrical difference happen. Well, that all falls apart if the concentration of potassium in the extracellular fluid gets messed up. So we have this very true thing. Too high potassium is fatal, too low potassium is fatal. And we have the added problem of potassium levels are very hard to measure accurately. All that said, those of you who will take care of patients in hospitals, you're going to deal with potassium issues on an everyday basis, right? Anybody work in a hospital or have worked in a hospital? So now many of you have. How many potassium labs have you seen go through? Lots and lots and lots. And it's because of, we've got this problem. Potassium concentration is important, but measuring it is difficult. So we end up with this kind of catch-22, which I talk a little bit about coming up here. So I'll talk a little bit more about the catch-22 in a minute. Okay, so aldosterone plays a role in sodium and potassium. Oh, we're out of time. Shoot. Okay, wow, that went fast. All right, we'll pick up here next time when you have fresh minds. Yes?
I'm not sure if I'm reading this correctly, but I thought that when osmolarity is greater than normal, it's hypertonic. And then when it's less than normal, it's hypotonic.
Yeah, greater than normal. Did I mess up the symbols? Yeah, I get the alligator confused to this day. So here, I'll make it simpler. When the fluid is greater than normal, yeah, I messed up the symbols. Thank you. I even thought about it and still messed it up. Yeah, alligator goes towards the bigger one, right? So when the fluid is less than normal, fluid is greater than normal. Fixed? Yes. Thank you. So you all knew about the alligator, right? I still have to do this sometimes too. It's a lesson, right?